Lovely to see you again.
Hi, I'm Elena. I'll be speaking first. I'm also doing the reply, and she, her works well.
Hello, my name is Juana. I'm the second speaker for team opposition, preferred pronouns she, they. Good luck.
Hello, I'm Valerio. I'm op3, preferred pronouns he or they, whichever is fine. Let's have a great debate.
Hi, thank you. Can I check if all the judges are here?
I think all judges are present. Hi, my name is Emma, she, her. Looking forward to the round.
Hi, my name is Mateusz, he, him. I'm looking forward to the round as well. Good luck to both teams.
Hi, my name is Matt. I use he, him pronouns. Good luck to both teams.
All right, thank you. Before we begin, I have 4 reminders. So firstly, I'll be keeping time for this debate by texting into the Zoom chat at the 1 minute, 7 minute, 8 minute, and 8 minutes and 15 seconds mark. At the end of the speech, I will type the total time spoken for the speech. Secondly, before you speak, please indicate how you would like to receive your POI, whether that be verbally, visually, or in the chat. Thirdly, speakers who are not speaking in this round, such as coaches, team managers, and observers, please be reminded to switch off your camera and mute yourself at all times throughout the debate. Now, lastly, if you are a designated speaking member or a member of the judging panel in this round, please switch on your camera throughout the debate. This is so that we know that you are on the call and can attend to you if there are any dropouts. I will hand the floor over to the chair judge now for this round. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome everyone to the Octo finals of the World Schools Debating Championships. First of all, congratulations to both teams for making it this far. I wish both of teams best of luck in the round. And having said that, let's get the debate started. I give the floor to the first proposition speaker to open the debate. Good luck.
Just checking, am I audible? And then also, can I ask that the opposition team please say something so that when we ask like POIs, we know that this works, because we've had trouble with this in the past.
Does this work? Are we audible?
Yes, thank you. Cool. POIs in the chat. I think that's already been said. Cool. I will count myself in. I'll start in 3, 2, 1, now. If the founding fathers had heard about the fact that people can carry guns like AK-47s, which can kill hundreds of people in a matter of minutes, we think that they would have lost their minds. They would not be able to comprehend the fact that something as minor as an arms that an individual can carry, something that can do so much right, ought to be possessed as a mandatory right. We think that the constitutions as they are outdated, and we ought to have mechanisms to keep them in check. That is what we stand for on proposition. At the top of my speech, I want to note 4 points of framing. First of all, what do we think that this is likely to look like? Note for A, that this is going to be amendment like changes to the Constitution, whereby they're rewritten periodically over time from 30 to 50 years. And the comparative that they have to support is frequent minor amendments that change them semi-frequently. Note then that the Constitution forms a guiding principle toward the way that laws are formed. On our side, we think that that ought to be updated frequently. Secondly, that this happens on like a three-fourths basis, similarly to how it does under status quo. On their side, they have to defend things like Supreme Court justices and constitutional courts being the individuals that make these kinds of decisions. Thirdly, that this is likely to be done through delegates of certain bodies, i.e. religious, political, or regional bodies, similarly to how constitutions were originally drafted in the past. Fourthly, note that most people are happy with the foundation and they're not likely to support constant change. So instead, we think this is likely to be minor things like enshrinements of past laws or creation of new things to keep up to date with newer social standings, i.e. things like technology, i.e. changing racial quotas, and so forth. Note then the second point of framing as to why this is unlikely to go horribly wrong. 2 reasons here. One, that politicians are somewhat interested in the good of the country. This is because they as individuals are incentivized to be good so that they can A, upkeep somewhat decent legacies within their specific political parties. But secondly, many of them want to run in the future and they need that good reputation, that good perception from the public to be able to maintain and get by. But secondly, that you're likely to elect good people because it could go horribly wrong in future. This is why the US did not change the number of Supreme Court justices in their state, because they were fearful that this damages the existing democratic structures in such a way that leads the country to some sort of failure as a state. Secondly, thirdly and finally, what does this mean for our case? One, we think that opposition cannot run a case talking about how we get no change and radical change at the same time. We think if they do that in terms of responsive work, then they're largely going to contradict and undermine the mechanisms. But secondly, it means that our stance is simple. We think democracy on our side is most functional, not only for the people, but also for the principles that it ought to abide by. We're going to forward three arguments in support of that. One, that we get better constitutional creation on our side. Two, that we get better democratic engagement from the people. And thirdly, that we create less reliance on things like precedent. Before moving on, I'll take your point of clarity.
You're at the same time saying that you're only going to change commonsensical things that most people agree with. So what is the fundamental difference between this and just changing them on our side when most people already agree?
So one, I'll explain to you why in argumentation, but briefly, we think that you're going to do more than just change like minor things that people agree on, because it's quite difficult to do things like make amendments that create entirely new clauses in the Constitution, or do things like enshrinement within the Constitution. On our side becomes substantially easier, and I'll explain why in my substantive. First argument then on why we get better Constitution. Let's note that given the fact that the Constitution forms the guiding principles for how democracy and governments ought to function within most constitutional democracies, i.e. things like laws and governing principles and the kinds of things that governments are capable to do are dependent on this argument is of the utmost importance. I want to observe three problems faced by the Constitution and the status quo. One, that it enshrines, that it upholds largely old values because of the times that they were made. The US Constitution is roughly 100 years old. The reason this becomes problematic is because the kinds of problems that they faced at the time are nowhere near to the same as the kinds of problems we face now. Now we have to ask ourselves questions about things like AI and whether or not tanks constitute as weapons of arms, whereas at the time they had more simplistic things to worry about. Secondly, that we face new societal or economic problems because the economy has become substantially more complicated as we've progressed. The way that it interacts with society has changed, and the needs that we face in terms of social progress have changed. Thirdly, let's note that there are different cultural contexts within which manifest themselves in terms of language and ambiguity within that. So you have things like really difficult to interpret things. But secondly, note that when you frame and talk about the problems within the Constitution, you oftentimes change the narratives and notions surrounding them. And you cannot ask these individuals who created the Constitution whether or not this is what they meant. Thus, you land up seeing really inconsistent applications thereof. Note this is harmful because it creates control. This is the thing that controls laws and rights on our side. So when you have the underlying premise of how your country is functioning being set up on a somewhat wishy-washy system, we think it's quite difficult for you to progress going forward. The way we change this goes twofold. One, we think that we get more constructive rewrites of the Constitution because single amendments, as they have to defend on their side, are controlled by individuals like the Supreme Court Justice or like separate courts on their side. What this then means is it's oftentimes going to be really long-winded processes because you have to win multiple bipartisan things because the idea of changing the Constitution is relatively irregular. So it's due to be like a massive political storms. On our side, what you do is you manifest a culture whereby this is something that takes place on a regular basis, and it's a necessity to the function of democracy because it's mandated to happen every 30 to 50 years. What that then means is when people are trying to create changes, they're likely to be more accepting of these things and more willing to adapt. But secondly, we think that this idea of constitutional changes are just infrequent because they stall government function. This is because you need to do things like consultation or win over bipartisan voting on their side. On our side, what you do is you create things like committees or delegations that are dedicated to these things, but secondly, because it's an expected slowing down of your government, you give people the capacity to prepare for these things. So we think that you're more likely to be able to say, let's default back to the old one whilst this is changing. This isn't something that stresses us out, thus we're more open to the notion of doing it. Why is this important? One, we think that self-defense in terms of democratic functioning occurs through the Constitution because it's an individual's primary mechanism of holding the government and the lawmakers accountable. Insofar as we weigh that up against any form of stability, we think giving people access to the idea that the government is something that can protect them from broader state and the fact that they can engage politically far outweighs that. Thus, we get better constitutions on our side. Second argument then on democratic engagement. What we say here is that democracy is largely problematic. People aren't buying into it as it's on the status quo. We think it faces problems like populism and all sorts of things. We make that better 3 ways. One, we create better connection to the Constitution. This is because things like language, things like the time that it was made in, and the cultural context are now more directly connected to individuals. In South Africa, our Constitution was made roughly 25 to 30 years ago, yet individuals already see problems as to how things like property laws are enshrined by them. They feel a disconnect to the very thing that is designed to create a connection between them and the government. Secondly, the Constitution feels more flexible and modern. This appeals to the trend that people think politics are an elitist or outdated and never-changing space. Insofar as you show individuals that this changes and their political vote means something, we then think that you create the idea that they can buy into this. But secondly, this gives them the idea that they can now change the focus of the nation and make it determine on what society and the state wants, i.e., do you want your state to be focused on freedom and acceptance or other more dated ideals? What are the impacts of this? One, we get more individuals represented within our Constitution. That means that people themselves feel like they can engage more frequently. Two, we reduce apathy because people no longer feel like democracy is determined by arbitrary things which were decided by old people hundreds of years ago, and they feel like they can make a change. But thirdly, there's less populism because now when people feel angry at the state, they no longer feel like they have to go riot and become radical towards one end or the next. They understand that these are things that can change over time. This is important because A, we get more stability on our side, given the fact that people are more likely to buy into democratic systems. Two, it impacts every citizen within these states. And thirdly, the quality of change is great. On proposition, we think that changes in society need to be represented by changes in the Constitution. Never been prouder to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now to open on behalf of the opposition, the floor goes to Op 1. Good luck.
Hi, am I audible? Can you hear me? Is everything fine? Okay, great. Just 1 second. For POIs, do them visually if you can, or audibly. Just don't type them in the chat. Thank you. Panel, let's bring some common sense into this, because what we're talking about here is the literal constitution of a country, the body of law that is fundamental to every other pieces of law that are ever drafted. This type of law does not need that type of constant changing, because to the extent to which you set the rules of the game properly from the get-go, that is the point at which it is wide enough and clear enough in order to be able to be reused for times. I'm going to have 3 parts to this speech. Firstly, I'm going to have direct engagement with what we hear from them, their setup and also their arguments, and then I'm going to go into our 2 arguments, firstly on protecting the power of the Constitution, and secondly about the constant meddling being outrageously risky on their side of the house. But panel, note that before anything else, I want them to be very clear about who will actually be changing this Constitution, because they're running away from this by not making explicitly from the first. The reason they're running away from this is because they know that the political bodies at the time, the people that, actually draft our laws, are going to be the ones that are going to change the Constitution on their side of the house. This is to say, the politically motivated parliament within these sequences in which you get to change the Constitution is going to be able to amend it. They have to own up to them being political interests and incentives within it. This opens up a whole plethora of discussions, which I'm willing to have in my argument. But secondly, note panel, that 30 to 50 years is an incredibly long time. If they want to claim any of their benefits as to how you help the population be more engaged with how the Constitution works, or if they want to claim any of their benefits about constant rejuvenation of this Constitution constitution, then they need to own up to the fact that it's probably going to be more frequent than that. Then they give us this whole thing and whole narrative about how societies evolve, and that's why you need constitution change. Panel, our first claim here is that you don't need to, because once you establish a clear set of laws, no thank you, that is fundamental and widespread enough to then no longer need to be able to amend it. Because panel note that for all of the changes that they claim, economic changes and AI changes, you can change them through regular laws and policies that you pass at every quarter, or like regular things that you engage with in society. You don't need to go to the root of the constitution, the root of law, in order to get any benefits from it. And then they give us this whole claim about how politicians are likely to do it well because they're interested in the good of the country. Panel, again, some common sense here. I don't think that's generally the case, just because I think human nature prevents them from it. I don't think the people in power are these idealistic people that constantly want the benefit of humanity. I think they're rather self-interested people who are in good positions of power and privilege and want to maintain those positions of privilege. That means that they're likely going to change this in the way they see best fit, rather than doing a heroship act all throughout. But then, panel, lastly, I want to be very clear. No, thank you, not now. I want to be very clear about our last claim here. Note, panel, that in the status quo, amendments need to be proposed. And if we see something that is not in accordance or not right, you can go through the whole process altogether, right? You have to debate each amendment and happens. On their side of the house, every time they want to switch the constitution, they can go through every clause of the constitution and risk deeming it unfair. I'm now going to enter our two arguments. The first one about protecting the power of the Constitution. I'm going to make more things clear here. Panel, this Constitution, I want to be very clear about how it looks like, because we say it largely sets two things. It sets organic laws as to how the society has to function and the fundamental rights and liberties of people. The Constitution is meant to be not extremely specific to, have to change it every year, but to be a fundament for everything else. This means that most of the times, it mainly ensures the checks and balances and the institutions that regulate each other within the society, right? Most of the times, it is built in order to make sure that the architecture of politics and democracies work. Architectures which don't need to be constantly changed the way side proposition claims, because there are fundamental things like the separation of power within the states or the independence of the judiciary. I don't think side proposition would want to change those things, right? But note, panel, secondly, that most of the times they're built post-revolutionary times, right? Constitutions, no thank you. When people got idealistic and usually copied the constitution of those solid democracies, right? It looks like the Eastern Bloc taking, after getting rid of communism, inspiring its constitution from France in order to build a solid system. This means to say that the constitutions are solid here. These old values are still relevant because they're not values that deter or become worse during time. They're still the values that democracies functions on. This means that to the extent to which they claim that you need some change, you say if that change is commonsensical and everyone already agrees to it, you can have the ad hoc ways of constantly changing it, right? If something is outrageously old and it's clear that most of society no longer wants it, then we say you're going to have it on our side of the house. But you don't need to overwhelmingly change most of the Constitution. And we say at the end of this argument that principally the reason we want the Constitution to be very difficult to change is because we want it to be hard and above the regular laws, right? That's why we have so many roadblocks to destroying it in the first place, because we think it is something so fundamental to preserving how democracy ultimately works that you shouldn't be able to change it depending on the political party at power or depending upon random things such as when the cycle goes on. Before my second argument, I'm glad to take a point.
If everything you say is true and the values of the Constitution are fine, we just won't change it very much on our side.
Excellent. So if you won't change it very much on our side, then why have these cyclical things which open up a lot of risks rather than just keep the ad hoc ways that we're doing now? And let me be very clear what risks you're opening up to, because this BOI was a great gateway into my second argument about the constant meddling being outrageously risky. Then I'll note that even though politicians might not be intrinsically evil and they might actually want to do what's best, we still think this is a terrible idea, right? Because we think that in as much as you get to power and have so much power, you're likely to have three specific types of incentives that influence how you work. First of all, as a politician, you want to please the people that put you in power, which is other politicians, other lobbying groups, or your superiors politicians, right? This means you have pressures to act and change this body of law however they see fit. Secondly, you say, as a politician, you might have your own ideas about how the game should be played or the law should look like, right? Specifically because people are intrinsically selfish and self-looking. This means that they have incentives to change the game the way they see fit, create more gerrymandering laws or more filibusters or whatever else may be. But thirdly, your electorate might be actively anti-certain things, anti-certain minorities. This means you have electoral incentives to be the one that changed the constitution, right? Look at this, for example. This means that you can fundamentally, at the point at which you can actively harm this constitution, this is fundamentally different from any other law, right? Because if you enshrine some people as second-class citizens because you were able to change the constitution, there's very little going back from there. The comparative on our side of the house is that you can only change a few articles and need to be very specific, convince huge majorities of people in order to do that, which of course gives you limited impact for change, but enough to secure the very outdated one and not open up a lot of risks, right? And we say the risks panel are huge. The risks are about maintaining your grip of power for long, long times, right? Maintaining the political systems that keep you as a politician in power. And this is very important. My last part, why will the population be fooled and go with it? Because panel, we think most people are very legally illiterate. We think number one, the electorate has a huge inability to pay attention to what you're doing and how you're changing. This means that you're not going to be supervised or scrutinized to what you're changing. Secondly, most people are legally illiterate. Someone will have to explain to them what they're doing. And if they're biased, they're going to be able to convince these things that anything works. Secondly, if you change something so big, you open up loopholes that you can insert to give you more power. In the US, when they did the $1 trillion stimulus checks, most money didn't go to people, but it went to the military budget. That's the type of loopholes you open up to power. That's why we oppose.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. And now to continue on behalf of the proposition, the floor goes to Prop 2. Good luck.
Sorry, can we hear me now? As said earlier, please make POIs is in the chat. And the present evolution of society cannot continue to be shackled and stymied by that of the past outdated practices. We think not only does opposition miss what this debate is about, but we don't think they actually engage with the need for society to progress, with the need to be free from constitutional laws written over a century ago. Let's understand firstly and recontextualize what they've actually misinterpreted. Firstly, how do we think that these assemblies themselves are likely to happen? Because what they tell us, and most of their harms are centered around the politicians themselves. Note, we think that we can claim that it's fairly intuitive when the emphasized states delegates that we're going to be adopting similar systems to that of the US, where you have outside members other than government contribute to writing the constitution. We've seen this happen many times. South Africa's constitution, the US constitution, the Canadian constitution. There's significant precedent for that enough to be within profit. And we think that in itself is the point where most of their harms on politicians, they then need to prove why those harms are likely to be applicable to every single member who's opting into writing this constitution, such as academics, scholars, people who are used to represent different communities and parts of society. Secondly, we get this idea that they question the 30 to 50-year timestamp that we put, and saying that how are people going to be rejuvenated in political discourse? Simple. One, note that changing the constitution in of itself is an enormous action, and rewriting it and reforming the foundational laws, as they claim, is something which is likely to garner attention, right? Especially if it doesn't happen that often. People know that this is one particular chance to have their voices heard and what they think should be the founding principles of this society. We can claim that. But let's add a second level and understand why this is important, framing, because we simply think that that's sufficient enough to see how society has progressed progress and grown over the years in terms of assessing that ability. Here we think that years in assessing different changes in technology and moral values is critical. Then let's understand then what they've pushed on us in terms of responsibility. All they've said here on response to our P1 is that laws are enough to fulfill the benefits that we want to give you. Let's assess why that's not true. One, let's understand that laws themselves are capable of being repealed, which is innately very difficult. Which innately makes it very difficult to make long-standing regulation. This is particularly exacerbated when we see instances like the US, where you have two-party systems or even multiple-party systems who are actively attempting to undermine the legacy of other individuals. We think that lasting practices binding individuals to specific laws is necessary. Secondly, let's then also understand that amendments, which is also their alternative, are not sufficient. Why do we think that that is true? Because we think that at the point at which you're consistently amending something, you're still struggling to replace and actively remove the harmful legislation, right? This means that even at their best, harmful legislation such as gun rights, allowing people to continual access, are still going to exist. They haven't shown us how that is going to exist or how that's going to be changed on their side. Or how that's going to be changed on their side of the house. Then let's recontextualize why they haven't responded to us and why that's harmful. Because what we told you coming out of Proposition 1 was that it's essential for a representative society to occur with an ever-changing constitution. Note here, at our worst, we accomplished absolutely nothing except rewriting that constitution in itself. This means that making it more accessible to the public, making it much more conversation of discourse, where people can see that the foundation of law that exists within the country is one that's built within your lifetime and actively feel represented within the government, increasing buy-in to the ultimate government structures, increasing the maximum output we get into democracy because people see themselves in the founding principles of that country. But they don't actually understand how we get better institutions on our side because they don't actually respond to what we told you in terms of the removal of harmful practices. We think our rebuttal has also shown that. Let's then go on the offensive and look back at what they've told us. They told us, no, guys, values are constant, and that means that because those values are constant, there's not going to be a need to replace them. First response, let's mitigate it. Because we don't think that all these values, which they say are completely beneficial, are going to be changed on our side. If anything, they'll be reworded and made better on our side to look at specific contexts as how society evolves. So this looks like merely saying that freedom of speech is a right to stating how freedom of speech is a right existing in the age of social media and how companies who are then in charge of that right would need to monitor it as a guiding principle. Then let's also understand, panel, most of their case is literally hung on constitutions being good. Why? I don't understand. Because most of the time, these constitutions are written by people who are out of date with society, people who have values such as being racist, such as actively bigotry and trying to make principles which might not actively harm those groups, but are literally preventing them from being able to access basic fundamental protections on the basis of their identity not being accounted for within those constitutions. Then, in terms of these politicians, let's take them at their best. If politicians are going to have some level of power, all they tell us here is that politicians won't get scrutinized, the voters can't access this with laws. Now, either they think people are extremely stupid under their side, where you can't understand that if a politician is literally making an infringement to change how gun laws work, that you won't be able to access a certain amount, how that changes. We think that people do have that basic understanding of the law, but we think that there are more than enough news sources from different sources to account for the bias that they claim will be present in order to make sure that that large amount of public scrutiny, which is essential to hold politicians accountable, will change. We think that we achieve that on our side. Before I move on into how we get a significantly better precedent and how a better functioning law and legal system under the Constitution, yes, I'll take it for you.
At this point, you wash down your case to some rewording and some limited changes here and there. So why isn't the Constitutional Court enough to constantly remind us what the Constitution should be and reinterpret it just as it does in the present?
Because we've seen the US have 13 amendments in 200 years. We think that in instances, large amounts of capital are able to do that. Large amounts of structures are able to bypass that in order to get the conversation. We'd rather have it on a continual basis, which can happen at the point at which we need urgent practices to remove harmful legislation. We can also claim that benefit. Let's then talk about how we get better than engagement with current precedents that exist within society. Because let's understand contextually, how a legal system works is mainly lawyers drawing on legal precedent, which is then determined by founding constitutional values in terms of how they govern, how in order to form certain laws and bypass certain cases. Why has this been incredibly harmful under their side? Because most of these precedents, considering the people who wrote it are likely to have some form of bigoted practices, have things that people draw from that constitution or draw legislation which is permissible under a certain constitution. Under that, using that precedent as a way to back it up, which means that comparatively, when you fight for a minority's rights who've not been historically protected, having to continually find matter, which is difficult, and finding a legal precedent and finding portions of it to aid you is a consistent harm that is placed onto minorities, right? This means that at best, you can't get something further than the Civil Rights Act in the US because that can still have limited repealment. You can't have it placed in the Constitution. It's very difficult for you to find barriers of access and so it's very difficult for you to find specific areas which you can use to prove that that is an innate fact that needs to exist beyond that. We think that on the comparative, having a changing constitution which addresses how society functions in general and its overall evolution, recognizing those minority rights, removes the need for that precedent, makes it much easier for lawyers to simply win on the grounds in terms of representing harmed and minority candidates, simply on the grounds of either using the new constitutions that's made or removing the factors of precedent that many other people have moved. There's been a disjunct between the law of a country and how its people actually engage with their own morality. Fix that by siding with proposition, fix that by continually changing that constitution.
I'd like to thank that speaker for that speech. And now to continue on behalf of the opposition, the floor goes to Octo. Good luck.
Am I both audible and visible? Okay. The principle of democracy is the fondest thing we have within our societies. And for that, we must protect it. What Team Proposition does in this debate is the opposite. So proud to oppose this motion. So what I'll do in this speech is firstly have two clarifications about the motion, and secondly, I'll tackle each and every one of their points and make you see why they are wrong with them. First clarification, we say, note that Team Proposition's case is entirely based on the United States. It's very US centric. The United States is not the only country we're debating about. The only example they could come up with is actually changing gun laws in the United States. We don't think that's the core of it. We are also speaking about other Western countries, and even countries like Romania, where there is functional democracy, which is not really a presidential democracy, but rather has other features. But furthermore, they fail to even address our PY. We ask them, why aren't constitutional courts enough? And what they say, well, because in 200 years, the US hasn't done anything. Well, I'm sorry, but that's not really a response. And I'll present to you in my speech why constitutional courts actually have something to say. But B, note that they keep contradicting themselves. Firstly, they say, well, we'll have significant enough changes, but then they say, well, we'll have just minor changes, they won't matter so much. So which one is it? Because I really don't understand. Please clarify that for me. But panel note that the relevance of this clarification is that the more minor the change, the bigger the risks they have on their side of the house. And we say these risks are not worth it at the end of the day. But I'll explain that furthermore in my speech. So first point I'm going to tackle, they say, well, we'll have civil society delegates, right? That means that we'll have people from the society actually being delegates. We have multiple contentions to that. Firstly, is that actually council representative? We say it's not. Panel note that in order to be able to draft and modify a constitution, you need a couple of things. Firstly, you need legal terminology. You need to be an expert in that thing, really. You can't really be a simple person just having an average job. You have to know some things about it. You need legal experts for that constitution to be drafted carefully. On our side of the house is that comparatively, we have politicians who are helped by advisors, but also politicians are elected. Politicians, whatever they do, they have been voted for the people, and they respect the fundamental premise of democracy, which is really representation. But we say the same mechanisms that apply to these people certain mechanisms apply here. Firstly, we say they are prone to lobbying as well. They are prone to receiving bribes. They are prone to all of these mechanisms that they claim won't happen on their side of the house. But furthermore, I'm not really sure, and there's no mechanism in their case which proves that these people will be less racist or less sexist, or they will have less biases. So we really don't know how these people are elected, right? We don't know if there is any democratic process within that. But furthermore, note that this is fundamentally relevant in flawed democracies, in countries like the Balkans, which are democracies, but really what happens is that the politicians in power can actually incentivize them or pay them or threaten them to make the changes that they want. This means practically giving more power, changing organic laws, like giving more power to the prime minister or the president, dissolving parliament and stuff like this. These are not risks we're willing to take. But secondly, they bring a point about how people are going to be more engaged in politics because now suddenly there is civil society within these councils. And they say that that's really false. Because panel, on the same logic, people should be really involved in politics in the status quo because politicians in the status quo give laws every year. But that's not true. In Romania, we have voting presence about 40%. In Norway, it's 80%. And that has nothing to do with how things are, but rather it has something to do with the level of democracy in those countries and how happy people are or how much trust they have in their governments. No, thank you. And furthermore, they have one more point about populism. And we say populism does not appear because the constitution is not drafted properly, but populist politicians actually capitalize on people's vulnerabilities like poverty, like socio-economic disenfranchisement. So we don't see really how that stands. But let me speak to you about the Constitutional Court and why it's fundamentally important. Panel, we say constitutions, no thank you. Constitutions are the basic set of laws that countries have, right? Why do countries have these laws? Firstly, to see how a country is governed, to see the role of the prime minister, the role of the president, the role of the parliament and so on, but also rights and liberties. We say these are basics, these are checks and balances for the state. But furthermore, we tell you that the constitutions are made in such a manner that they can be interpreted with time by constitutional courts, even on their own metric in the United States. We tell you that the US Constitution, based on it, Obergefell was drafted. This is the legislation that actually awarded gay marriage to gay people. Roe v. Wade was awarded because it was based on the right to privacy within the US Constitution. We say there are methods to spill things around, especially because the Constitution has the basic of things in it. But furthermore, we say what they are trying to do will actually destabilize constitutional courts. Why? Because they will seem as less valid, as less relevant. They will lose legitimacy, which means we lose a mechanism for checks and balances on their side of the house. And that's fundamentally flawed, because you now really can't or don't have, if the constitution is revised every 30 years or every 50 years or whatever time they might be, they really have no incentives to actually look upon those laws, or for people to actually tell to the court, well, this is flawed, we don't want this. Before I move on, sure.
Do you believe that people are less bigoted now than they were 200 years ago?
Less what?
Do you believe that people were less racist, sexist, and other forms of discriminatory measures now than they were 200 years ago?
People are less racist now, of course, but in the Constitution of the United States, you still have freedom and equality, right? So I don't see how that's really relevant on your side of the house. But furthermore, let's speak about this point of theirs, about better constitutions, about social progress. We tell you social progress happens, but this is not the means to achieve it. We have, firstly, no guarantee that the delegates will rule according to the social progress. And furthermore, if these things are so minor on their side of the house, we say that it's not worth taking the risk for flawed democracies, for corruption, for lobbying these people. But secondly, we tell you about democratic engagement, and we tell you about things. If you don't want to meddle too much within these councils, we tell you if you have minor changes, we'd rather protect other things on our side of the house. So what's the silver lining of our case, panel? We say that rather, if you want to change minor things, or if you want to change things, it's better not to take the risks. There are democratic mechanisms in place right now for that. We don't need these delegates. We're not sure how they work. Let's not take this risk.
I would like to thank that speaker for that speech. And now to continue on behalf of the proposition, the floor goes to Prop 3. Good luck.
Hi there, can you hear me if I speak like this? Fantastic. I'll take POIs in chat like the rest of my team. I'll begin in, sorry, as soon as I get my timer. Right, I'll begin in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I'm so glad that Romania accused us of being US-centric, because now I get to talk about South Africa. Because the South African Constitution is less than 30 years old. It was established in a post-revolutionary context like opposition wants, and it is arguably the most progressive constitution in the world for liberal access to human rights. But still, panel, South Africans less than 30 years after the inception of their constitution criticize it for being too heavy-handed on protecting property right laws, which means that it has been impossible so far for the South African government post-apartheid to redistribute land that was stolen from Black people in the 1950s, because the Constitution enshrines white people's right to that land in its property clauses. It would be much better for South Africans if 30 years after the end of apartheid, we could rewrite our constitution in a way that is more relevant to struggles that we didn't even know we were going to have 30 years ago. Apply that logic, panel, to a government that wrote their constitution 200 years ago, when they couldn't even conceptualize things like data as a mechanism by which to evaluate privacy. Things like whether AI are going to be considered sentient or deserving of human rights. Even things like the fact that my first speaker tells you that the founding fathers couldn't possibly have known what it would mean for modern Americans in the South that they said they are allowed to bear arms. Panel, 2 questions. Number 1, is it necessary to change constitutions often the way that we would suggest. Note that this is the main thrust from opposition, and it's a rather unstrategic one, because even if we were to concede all of that matter and say, yes, in the vast majority of states, constitutions are fine and they probably don't need to be changed that much, and our mechanism is somewhat unnecessary, we're still able to accrue some benefit. But secondly, that just makes the debate uncontentious, and it just means that at our worst, we are neutralized. But panel, thirdly, that isn't even the place where the debate ought to happen. The debate ought to happen in places like the US, where rights for Black people and the abolishment of slavery remains a tag-on to a constitution that was fundamentally racist at its inception. We think it's necessary to change, but even if it wasn't, we still win in those cases. And why do they say this mechanism? They say, firstly, the constitution ought to be big and vague and fundamental. It ought not be specific. Fine. It also won't be specific on our side. If that's the role of a constitution, then it will still be a constitution. What's likely to change are things like fundamental understandings of the values of the country, i.e. perhaps the USA is tired of having a small government orientated around individualism and wants to move to a bigger government orientated around a more welfare-centric state. So that's symmetrical. But secondly, they tell us that constitutions were fine from the beginning and there's no need to change them because they were like all established post-revolution. Like, firstly, no, that's just not historically true. But secondly, we show you with a plethora of examples why it is necessary in the vast majority of instances to change constitutions, even if the people who made them were incredibly well-intentioned. They are probably out of date. Then they go on to tell us that they can get amendments just as easily as we can on our side, and change is symmetric, which panel is principally inconsistent with their claim that the constitutions ought to never change, but secondly, just isn't true, because amendments require an enormous amount of political support at any given time, and are also tend to be controlled by arbitrary people in government like senators and constitutional court judges who aren't even elected and only go out of power when they die. Panel, the fact that they back this shows how disproportionately they misunderstand the concept of democracy and representation. Why do we tell you it is absolutely crucial that constitutions are able to change and that their necessity claim doesn't stand? Firstly, constitutions are far more representative on our side, because panel, if the constitution is as important as they claim and it governs literally all of the laws that control your life, it is probably important that you understand it and that you feel connected to it, and that it is something that happens in your lifetime and something that you can understand. But then secondly, we tell you that representation requires evolution. That's why we're not okay with abolishing term limits on our side, because we think that you have to have new politicians and new leadership and new constitutions as often as necessary in order to have evolving representation. But secondly, we tell you that in absence of the principle of democracy itself, people feel far more heard and represented on our side, which is likely to disintegrate trends of apathy and populism, because people are disgruntled with elitist political institutions. Their only response is a one-liner in second that says, only poverty gives rise to populism, it's not about politics. No, panel, the fact that you feel disgruntled and misrepresented by your political elite, if you are able to craft a narrative as a politician that those elites don't care about you, is the reason for things like populism. And if we can tell people that their views matter more on our side and that their constitution is something they can actually understand and carry in their pocket the way that South Africans do because it was written in 1994 and we actually know what it means, then that's good for your ability to feel represented. Their other response is the idea that 30 to 50 years isn't going to cut it, you're not going to feel represented. Panel, 30 to 50 years is like twice in your lifetime, right? Given that the constitution is a massive thing, I think if it changes twice in the time that you're alive, you're probably going to feel closer to it on our side than you do on theirs. Note, all of those impacts on people feeling represented and voting more often and not succumbing to populism and not taking that POI are not contingent on us actually having to change the constitution very much. So even in their best case scenario, where the constitution is fine from the outset, and the only thing that happens every 50 years is that you review it and you decide that it's fine and you move on with your life, which is plausible on our side, you still get all of those benefits independent of their best case scenario. The impact of this clash is huge, because the constitution, as they conceived from the outset, governs everything. To the extent that it is necessary that it change often and become representative, to the extent that they have lied to you about this consistently throughout the debate, this ought to be weighed as important and we ought to be winning immediately. Go quickly.
You have one last chance to finally explain how the delegates are selected and put in place on your side, so you have a model.
From the outset, delegates are likely to be selected representing a vast variety of subsects of society, that is, regional subsects, religious groups, like interest groups, academics, politicians, opposition party members. We don't care. We'll literally include like whoever opposition wants. But those are the people that are going to have disproportionate power in this process, like my first speaker tells you. And that's why from the outset, a lot of their claims about politicians being politically motivated and evil aren't going to stand, because they don't even have the power to do this. It would be absurd that they suggest that we have to defend the politicians who will be held to account by the Constitution literally being the ones that write it. But even if they did have some power, number one, we'd say that bipartisanship probably means that there will be a balancing out of incentives, and we're not going to get things like gross human rights abuses, because like we say from the outset, constitutional agreements on our side during these periods of rewriting are going to require enormous majorities to be passed. So we're not going to see outlandish policy. But secondly, if we get conservative policy sometimes, that's fine. Number one, it's symmetrical. They probably get conservative amendments and laws on their side as well. My second speaker tells you why things like precedent are likely to be better on our side, which minimizes the impact of conservative things. Number two, even the most conservative politicians in the USA today are less conservative than the founding fathers who literally wrote women and Black people out of the Constitution. Even if that's our only impact, we'll take it. But thirdly, panel, there's this narrative in debating that conservatives are always evil, and we just don't think they are. I think conservative policy, because it existed before and it will exist again, probably isn't going to cripple human rights on either side, given that this debate ought not happen in autocracies that in either world would abolish term limits and destroy human rights. This debate ought happen in places where it is actually likely. Given that they have misplaced this debate entirely, given that they haven't understood what it ought to have been about, but given, most importantly, that they don't know the importance of the Constitution for the people, we are unique in that regard. This debate goes to proposition.
All right, thank you very much for that speech. And now for the next opposition speech, the floor goes to the Op 3. Good luck.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is everything fine? Am I audible, visible, all good? Okay. I would prefer my POIs to be audible, I mean visual, but if I don't see you, you can also have your mics unmuted. Thank you. Prop 1 had a weak stance with not much that they were trying to prove. Then Prop 2 essentially washed all of the argumentation, making it contingent on rewording and some little changes. But then Prop 3 comes in with all of these big impacts that were largely unexplained. So the stance of Prop shifted so much you could just not give them the debate panel. At the end of the day, they tried to tell that they accrued some benefits, even if the Constitution is largely fine. I think that the moment they concede this, they lose the debate. Because if the Constitution doesn't need long overhaul changes, then there is no point in risking it, because those same benefits that they're claiming on their side of the house can be put on our side with significantly less risk, which will be the main purpose of my speech today. Before I enter the two main areas of clash, firstly on changes and secondly on the stability of the democratic institutions in a country, let's first have some clarifications. Who changes the Constitution? This is a question we asked Prop from the very get-go, and they never gave a definitive answer, not even when we asked them on Prop 3, because these delegates that they're talking about are a very unnuanced panel. They talk about all subsets of people from different layers of society. We think this is a problem because that essentially means that you have a very fractionalized amount of delegates, which means that it's going to be very hard for them to agree on what things should be done. Or maybe they will agree because they have a lot of concessions and they will have people that are generally politicians or are generally lobbyists that are going to push these reforms and these changes in the Constitution on their side of the house. The problem is that no matter what the situation is, we have no idea who names them, where they draw their legitimacy from, and moreover than that, it is likely that all of the different mechanisms that we provided from Op 1 about how they have their own personal incentives, about how they have people who put them in that position, which pressure them to change the Constitution the way that they want it. Moreover than that, and maybe some of them are politicians or have in the future thought or have thought of having a future prospect in politics. All of those mechanisms apply, which means that our very first speech took down the most important point, which is that these delegates are going to be unbiased and they're free from politics. That was a lot of the argumentation, what a lot of the argumentation was contingent on. Now, moreover than that, let's quickly address their principle on updating the Constitution, because at the same time they're claiming this huge impact of constantly updating it, they're telling us, well, not that often because the Constitution is mostly fine. So if the Constitution is mostly fine, how do we get those small changes that Team Proposition wants to have? Well, we could have a constitutional court which actively reinterprets what the Constitution is saying so that it is more in tune with what we have. And the only thing that still stands from Team Proposition is that the founding fathers never expected AIs or AK-47s. Okay, but they set up some principles that we should guide ourselves from, which means that a constitutional court can then think of those principles and figure out what we should do about AI or AK-47s or any other thing in society. Moreover, if the constitutional court is actually unable to do all of these things, we still have amendments on our side of the house. So we don't see why they have such a huge benefit, because we can always change the constitution in the small points where it actually matters. Now, before I enter the clashes, I want to do the weighing at the very get-go so you see where I'm going. Why you should care more about stability and avoiding risks than about their marginal changes on their side. Because if you're not changing a lot on their side and you only do it 30 to 50 years, their impact is essentially zero. But you're increasing the risk of something terrible happening to the entire democratic process, to breaking checks and balances, to breaking people's freedom, something we said from Op 1, that marginalized communities can be actively targeted and it can be enshrined in law. You're creating all of these risks with not a lot of impact. So if by the end of my speech, I managed to prove that one, the emotion is not the only way to do this. And secondly, it is a high risk that we destroy the fundamentals of our society, we win this debate. You can hold me accountable at the end of my speech. Before I move on, please.
Do you think that news organizations and human rights groups are simply going to allow human rights abuses?
Yes, thank you. We already dealt with this from Op 1 when we explained that there are a lot of ways to which politicians are able to introduce things that are not accepted by society, although we should be outraged about it. We already talked about the $2.3 trillion bill that they passed in the US, which included a lot of money for the US Army, which no one wanted. We already gave the examples from Op 1. This latest response from Prop doesn't even stand to our first op. Let's first enter the area of clashes. And here they try to of changes. And here they try to tell us that they are necessary. And although we agree that maybe some changes are necessary, the fact that they diminish their points to we won't change a lot, only some things, essentially destroys their own argumentation. Because we managed to prove that we have one, amendments that can also do the things they're doing, which is the small, sensible changes that they want, because that's what their case is resumed to. But moreover than that, we explained the point on Op 2 that was uninteracted with about the constitutional court losing legitimacy, because now people don't see it as legitimate to reinterpret the constitution the moment that we constantly change it. This is important because the constitutional court is a big mechanism for change, especially for disadvantaged groups. This takes down the entire point on precedent, because the constitutional court, if you want to play on America, has done a lot of good for these minorities, but moreover than that, in all countries, it is generally the one that keeps people in check. So regardless of whether things are changed or not, if politicians have incentives to change the constitution to benefit themselves, the fact that a constitutional court loses legitimacy is very important, because that means you lose a mechanism of checks and balances in democracy, which is very important and would have provided a lot of changes for the people that we want on our side. That's why we win that clash, because we still have this legitimacy. But now let's talk about stability. And Prop is very scared of this point, because that's why they keep diminishing their impacts panel. That's why they keep telling us that you only have small changes, that people are not going to do a lot of things, and only the commonsensical ones, because they're scared that politicians might have incentives to change it. And there is a risk panel, because one, there are active incentives to do it, because you have people that put you in that position. Even as a delegate, you have people who put you in that position, who pressure you to create small advantages for their side. That means that you are likely going to succumb to those pressures. Moreover than that, you might want to maintain power. You might want to have advantages for your social class as well. Not only that, You might think of a future prospect in politics, so you want to please the electorate. This is especially important when we're talking about minorities, because if you live in a conservative society, you have all of the incentives to enshrine into law that minorities should be subjected to discrimination, because that gives you electorate for the rest of your life from all of these political parties that are very conservative. All of these mechanisms have nothing to do with corruption or the bad will of people. They're just incentives. The only thing that stands from opposition that we can weigh this against is the idea that people are more engaged and there is less populism because you feel connected to the Constitution. And I don't know, personally, I don't think of the Constitution that often because it is a document we write so that the society can work, and from then on we can do everything else. The laws are more into people's focus than the Constitution itself. But moreover than that, I think that people are not going to feel represented when a group of delegates that they have no idea who they are, who are unrepresentative because they never elected them, are the ones dictating their own constitution. I think that is the moment to create a group of elites who decide the entire fate of your society, specifically because they are unelected, unrepresentative, massive loss on their side when they gave this response. Until now, I've been very charitable. I explained the incentives of politicians or delegates or whoever is going to change the constitution and how that increases the risk significantly. This is the second thing I told you about that we win on. I also explained how the motion is not a unique way to get to the things that we need, how we have so many other mechanisms that are destroyed on their side of the house, so we win.
Thank you very much for that speech. And now for the first reply speech of the debate, we go to the op reply. Good luck.
Hi, am I audible / visible? Is everything fine? All right, thank you. Proposition third has one last chance to model how these delegates are going to look like and who they will be and how they will be chosen. And I literally quote them saying, whomever side opposition wants. Panel, they are willing to cling the risk of democratic stability, the risk of our capacity to have fundamental values in society, the risk of backsliding, the risk of corruption entrenching in onto anyone, especially who their opponents in a debate want. And for what, panel? They're willing to do this, not for super drastic stuff, not for genuinely groundbreaking things we need in our society, but just to make it a tad more modern, because those people that wrote it are pretty old. Well, we say that doesn't stand in this debate. And to the extent to which they don't prove to us why this is so fundamentally important, it needs to happen, and just say people seem to be dissatisfied with it, but unclear exactly why, they lose this debate, especially at the point at which we prove to you that there are other mechanisms to achieve their own impacts and their own desires without opening yourself to all of these risks. Two mechanisms which we provided, in fact, which they had very little interaction with, about how you can have the Constitutional Court constantly interact and over-interpret this set of laws. That's why we set it from 01 to be so widespread and unspecific, because that's what the Constitution is. It's wide in order for it to be palatable to generations on end. But then you also have the mechanisms of ad hoc amendments, which we clearly explained that are far more representative, far harder to breach in terms of actually harming democracy. So if you want to get some change, if you want to rule out the most least commonsensical things that you have in the Constitution, you can on our side of the house, in a way that's representative for the people and in a way that doesn't open you up to huge extents of democratic instability. So then let us delve more into this. They give us their last response on who these delegates are as people representing all sorts of people within society, basically people who are fractionalized, thus unable to pass any sort of drastic change for the Constitution, which they might might or might not want, I'm unclear, by this time. But secondly, panel, note that even if these delegates are neutral, we explain to you how they're gonna be unrepresentative inherently because they're outside people. They don't take the population into account in it. But then, panel, what we set out this debate to be from 01 was that these delegates are likely to either be the politicians themselves, those people in parliament that, draft our laws, or they're going to look kind of like politician, lobbied by them the way we clarified on 02, or have to want to cater to their own self-interests, or to electorate pleasing and actually please the people that put them there, right? Because it's simple, panel. People want to maintain power. That's the mechanism that keeps having these people then, which means that the risks you open yourself up to are huge. And I find it abhorrent that they ignored that you're actually putting on the line the democratic safety of principles, the idea, the democratic safety of divisions of power. You're putting on the line your capacity to oust people that want to be extremists and keep their power and hold on to power too much for literally nothing. The last thing they have in this debate is that you're gonna get and engage more people and it's gonna be more fun for them to engage with politics. We made it very clear on 02 that one, people care more about the everyday laws and policies that actually impact their life drastically to that extent. But secondly, people are legally illiterate. They don't know about this. That's what's gonna allow these politicians to open up a lot of risks because people are not keeping them accountable. From the first speech, which explained to you how people don't have the attention span to constantly scrutinize what's going on. That's the mechanism that makes all of the risks we're talking about highly probable, highly possible. Even if it's once 50 years, we say it's terrible. And for all of these reasons, we take this debate.
Very much for that speech. And now to finish the debate on behalf of the proposition, the floor was the prop reply. Good luck.
Am I audible? Okay, cool. I will start in 3, 2, 1, now. Thus far in the debate, opposition's biggest problem with our case is that we have been realistic. On our side, we were never saying that small change is the aim. We simply accepted that is the most likely outcome given how democratic structures function. What we had to show you in this debate has and always been very simple. Not that our system is perfect, but just that it has been better than theirs, and we think we've sufficiently done so. 3 points of strategy at the top of the speech. 1, in our P1, we told you that they break democracy because of minimal change and those kinds of things. And sorry, in our P1, we said that they can't frame it as though we say we get minimal change and then that we break democracy on our side. Notice that they've done that exact thing to the accusatory nature of their rebuttal thus far. Second, that they've been democratically absolutist in the way that they want to engage with the Supreme Court, saying that, no, it's this perfect system, don't tamper with it. But the majority of their P2 and O1 speeches were like, no, it's fine when the Supreme Court does this because it's run by the very politicians that they say are so bad. But thirdly, they just ignore the way we frame this debate from the offset. We told you that it's likely to be done through individuals like delegates of politicians, of religious organizations, of different geographical groups in society, because that's how constitutions have been set up throughout the globe. They just assert that their counter framing is right, and then they assert that delegates are likely to be bad because the bad politicians are not the people that are going on. I hope you see how convoluted and inconsistent that their setup and framing for this debate has been. First question then, where do we get the best constitution? We gave you 3 problems with the Constitution and the status quo. 1, that they support old values. 2, that there are new societal problems that we face. And thirdly, that there's a cultural shift which dictate different stances on issues. We told you 2 ways that we solve that. 1, that we change the culture and the reasoning surrounding this because of just time setting. And secondly, that stalling makes it quite difficult for decisions to be made. And oftentimes they come out being relatively bad due to bipartisanship. Their only response is just asserting that, no, this is really, really bad for democracy. I've already pointed out why this is contradictory. What they said underneath this is that politicians will be bad because they have perverse incentives. We gave you 4 layers of response. 1, that they desire good PR for the future of their careers. Two, that they value democratic principles for the future of their parties and democratic alignments. Thirdly, that they fear public scrutiny because they are reliant on that for their mechanisms to change. But fourthly, that the likely comparative is not politicians making these changes, it's just delegates, whereby politicians form a small part of the group. But lastly, in terms of like framing and setup, there's still a 3-quarter rule. So they can't just run around saying, oh, we're going to change everything. But at our worst cases, we have to ask who represents these individuals in the Supreme Court. It's likely still the politicians who weren't elected by people, they were just put in there. Their case in terms of argumentation has been uncomparative. What this means is at worst, we are quite simply their case. Notice what that means is you can go so much higher and further than what they have to offer. Secondly, it means that we have more representative constitutions due to understanding unique cultural contexts that exist in the status quo, but secondly, having unique like cultural surrounding changes and the fact that there's likely to commitment to it being good. And thirdly, that we have more stable change because you're not just stalling democracy at random as the way they want to frame it, but instead these are planned decisions that aren't going to lead to things like government shutdown. Second question on democratic engagement. We told you A, people get better connection because they can change underlying premises of democracy, and B, that it feels more modern because 30 years is less than 100. The idea that it has happened in your lifetime and that you can set the focus of the country. Their response was rather shallow. They said 30 to 50 years is just way too long. That's non-comparative because 30 to 50 years is just less than 100. We think that was the premise there. They did not dispute this. Their argument was that constitutional courts worsen and lose legitimacy. A, my second speaker's argument has largely dealt with that and explained why precedent is better on our side. B, we explained to you why this is difficult to get to pass, thus you lose viability on their side. But thirdly, we told you that this leads to unelected social Supreme Justice courts, which are largely symmetric. On our side, we think that societal change needs to be represented in the Constitution. On theirs, they leave us behind in the Stone Age. We think that we're better off for society. Thank you.
Hello, VAT here. I will now cut the live stream